Yeah, since we are recording on the session and we are kind of at the mercy of the internet, I will ask people to keep your mics off and as well as your cameras, just to make sure that we have no issues with internet and so on. Today there's a second session on publishing that we are organizing, this spring. I'm here with my colleague, Rick Knowles. I'm Yana Meerzon, the president of CATR. So I am very grateful to Rick, for helping me with the sessions. The first one was on publishing an academic journal. This one is on publishing an academic book or an edited collection. And there will be one coming up on working on your proposal. So I think research proposal or research grant. I believe there was an announcement and a call for proposals for a workshop, so if you're interested, let me know or write to Matt Jones, the communication officer of our organization. So I would like to also introduce you to our fantastic guests today, to whom I'm extremely grateful for doing this session. Before I do that, however, I would like to say my acknowledgements. I would like to acknowledge that the University of Ottawa, in which I work, is situated at the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And I know that lots of people coming from very different places in Canada and in US, so if you feel comfortable and feel so, please put your acknowledgements into the chat. So today we are hosting Professor Susan Bennett, who is coming from us from University of Calgary, Professor Julie Listengarten, who's coming from University of Central Florida, Professor Daphne Lay, who's teaching at the University of California, Irvine, and Professor Ramón Rivera-Servera, who is now at the University of Northwestern University. So I'm not going to give longer introductions because the bios will send around, but I will invite our speakers when they start representing themselves to speak about their work and their position and their expertise. I also would like to acknowledge a help of a colleague of ours, Frédéric Guerre, who is helping us with French transcriptions in the chat. So yes, Frédéric?
I have a quick question for you, Yana. I can't
Yes.
find the transcriptions settings. They're not appearing on my bar here.
I think that the last time what we did, so Sylvain was basically just typing into the chat.
In the chat, okay.
Yeah. Perfect. So I think that was the, and we will have to kind of look over the chat because I would actually invite, our guests, and the audience, to post your questions in the chat, so while we're talking, and the first part would be more like a webinar, but the second part will be more participatory. So if you do have questions, kind of, keep it either in chat or in person, yeah. But for you, Frédéric, chat is
perfect.
Cool. Right. Just going back to the panel, so when we were organizing this panel, so I kind of invited our guests to think about this question of thinking, publishing an academic book, so either from the position of the publisher or editor, or from the position of the scholar, who are looking for publication right at home. So you will hear kind of double perspectives, from our speakers today, and you're welcome to ask different questions, related to that. I also asked each participant to tell us their kind of 3 do's and 3 don'ts, right? And so the kind of usual format, so what people would recommend, to do, as editors or as authors, and what they would recommend not to do. And the final thing I asked everybody also to do is to maybe position the questions to their own fellow panelists, about their own experiences and what they would like to share. We did get one question from the audience already. I will come back to that during the Q&A, right? And so on. Okay, I hope I said everything what I had to in terms of introductions, and without the future ado, I will probably go on to and invite Professor Susan Bennett to begin this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Yana. Thank you for the invitation, and hello everyone, and nice to see everybody here today. I've got a couple of things I wanted to talk about. One was the importance of fit with a publisher, and then I wanted to say a few things about edited collections, which I think sometimes seem like a simpler option when they're not. I have written monographs, I've edited collections, I have written for a book series, and I currently co-edit a book series. So I've seen this process from these different angles. And when I was thinking about what I might say today, it occurred to me that irrespective of the format that my project ultimately ended up in, whether it was a monograph or something in a series or whatever, that really very early on, the publisher, potential publisher, was part of my thinking. And what I want to emphasize with that is the importance to be thorough with your research, to take the time to do the research on the main publishers in our field or in related fields, to have a really strong sense not only of what they've published historically, but pay particular attention to their forthcoming titles, because it tells you what they're interested in right now, and to get to know the editors. When we have real-time conferences, it's quite easy to set up appointments with editors and chat to them and get a bit more of an intimate sense of the person, the press, and their interests. But I think it's really important to take the time to see where this project you're working on, or project I'm working on, might fit with a particular publisher, because different publishers have different points of focus, they have different preferences for approach, and often quite different audiences in mind. One could argue, for example, that theatre history, a sort of traditional theatre studies project, isn't going to be the same as a performance studies project. And if your work is trying to reach more than one field, I think that becomes ever more complicated. So really important to do your research there, and not to give your manuscript or sign up your project to the first publisher that shows an interest in it. I think it's tempting to take the bird in the hand, but it's often not the best decision. And I have moments of sadness, I guess, when I see a book that perhaps was deserving of a more visible publisher ending up with a very minor publisher, and it's sort of disappears from sight without getting the critical attention and critical engagement that it deserves. So talk to your colleagues, talk to your mentors, talk to publishers, talk to published authors to get a sense of where might be the best fit. And we do talk to each other all the time about those. I had a conversation just this past weekend with a colleague who has a substantially completed manuscript, knowing that because of the depth of archival research that it's based on, it's going to be a longer than average book. And we sort of batted this back and forward for, I don't know, 20 minutes or something. But really, at the end of it, came to the conclusion there were 2 university presses that would be interested in something this substantial on this topic. And so those are the ways that, that we get to work out, I think, fit. Edited books, I think, often seem like they're going to be easier and quicker. I think they're not, they're just different from other kinds of projects. And I always say to junior faculty that I mentor, do you like editing other people's prose? Which has a lot in common with grading student essays, to be honest. And some of the challenges of grading our students turn up when you're editing other people's prose. Is that a really good use of your time at this moment in your career? Sometimes it is, and I think that one of the times that an edited collection can really serve a good purpose is between major projects. So if you've just published your first monograph, an edited collection, perhaps particularly one that you do collaboratively with another colleague, can be a really good way of kickstarting your own thinking on something else. Because everyone who finishes a book has a moment where they think, well, what now? What am I going to do now? Because I've wrapped up this sort of major project. So I think that that can be a really good exercise at that time. And for those of us who are here in Canada, I think edited collections can often be a good preliminary for a SSHRT grant, because it then sort of inserts you into a particular conversation in a particular field. So that can be a good way of showing to the granting agency that you've got some field buy-in to a new area of research that you want to pursue. I'll just move, I think, to my do's and don'ts, and because I want to leave lots of time for questions. So do participate in our field in a way that consistently shows your work to that field. So in the early days, get your work into a working group or a seminar where it can be rough and in process. When it's further along, get onto panels and get your work featured so people start to recognize you as the person who's doing X. And certainly when you have your work completed and coming out with a publisher, make sure that you take the initiative to organize launches and other kinds of events to draw attention to your work. Do persist in finding the right publisher for your work. I can't say that loudly enough, I think. Do recognize that your publisher will do almost nothing in promoting your work to the field. We live in a time where a comprehensive marketing plan for a publisher is one email blast and a picture of your book cover on Twitter. So you're responsible for doing anything in excess of that. For don'ts, don't assume your dissertation will be a book. Some with substantial revision do become books, most don't. Sometimes publishing 2 or 3 chapters revised into article form will be the better outcome and will serve as a really strong calling card, your work having been peer-reviewed and published in major field journals for what it is you then go on to do. Sometimes, you know, in something like a special issue of a journal might be a good way to situate your own dissertation research in a broader conversation. Don't think that an edited collection is easier or quicker, and don't agree to write for a project or edit a project just because you get asked to do it, because everything takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. And if you don't start out with some passion for what you're working on, it's highly unlikely to build in the process. I think you have to start with something that you really, really want to do. My question for my colleagues here, and it's in response to my observation of how little publishers do to advertise our work, I'd like to know what strategies other people have for getting attention to your book or your collection or whatever. Thanks, Yana. That's my start off.
Thanks a lot, Susan. This is really already great beginning. I will stop for a second. You know, I'm just checking on Frederic. I don't see translations, transcriptions. Frederic, are you doing well? How are you doing?
Yes. So I'm doing it as at the end. I'm taking note, and then I'm going to be typing it. So I'm going to typing a summary at the end of the talk.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Yeah, because I was not sure, you know, just, you know, minor technical issues. So,
no problem.
Yeah, please follow. Yeah, well, thank you so much, Susan, for the beginning, you know, so, and for the, you know, starting this demystifying process of publishing and looking for publishers and so on. And reminding us, you know, that indeed, you know, the whole question of self-promotion kind of doesn't stop ever, which I think people kind of tend to forget. Me for sure kind of tend to forget. And with this, I will actually now turn to Julia and will ask her to continue maybe, you know, with your own position and so on. Yeah.
Thank you, Yana. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this exciting conversation. Well, I published my monographs and quite a few edited collections. So I actually very much agree with what Susan just said about this work. In fact, right now I'm in the middle of finishing 2 edited collections, and it feels really a lot, and it takes time, and totally agree with every single word that Susan shared about this kind of work. But today I'd like to talk a little bit about my experience as a book series editor. I'm not sure how that happened, that I was actually invited to be to co-edit a book series about 4 or 5 years ago on modern American drama with Brenda Murphy. But I was invited, and I didn't say no. I was a little scared, but also excited about this um, opportunity, and it was wonderful, but a lot of work. It was an 8-volume book series, so it actually had a beginning and end, and we looked at 8 decades. So there were 8 volumes, each covered 1 decade, starting from 1930s to the first decade of the 21st century. And so what we ended up doing as book series editors, we divided our work. So Brenda worked on the first 4 decades, and I covered the last 4, and we solicited book editors for each decade. So that was a highly structured process that we actually were giving by Bloomsbury. That was a Bloomsbury Press project. The book series that I'm working on right now is very different. It's also Bloomsbury Press, and the title is The Reflections on Contemporary Performance Process. So it's a very young book series. We are working right now with 4 volumes. 2 will be published hopefully soon, and 2 are at somewhat middle stages of their development. So I want to talk a little bit about what kind of work I do with authors and volume editors, and how I solicit proposals. For instance, in December, we organized a 2-part virtual panel and on theater and multilingualism, and invited Yana to chair this wonderful project. And so we call this a virtual companion. And we actually hope to continue to build on this roundtable discussion and turn it into a book. But out of this panel came actually a lot of questions and a lot of preliminary, I should say, proposals. So about 100 people joined for the discussion, and I think that panel generate some interest. So the way that I would like to work with authors who propose ideas, I actually work very closely, and so these are some of my do's that I'd like to share with you. So when possible, do try to work with book series editor directly rather than through the publisher, because I totally agree with Susan that publishers do really little helping, and it's a very formal and sometimes cold process if you send a proposal to the publisher, and then the publisher will share the proposal with the book series editors. But if you'd like to have sort of more involved and deeper relationship with a book series editor, I highly encourage that you start this process from the beginning. You can submit, you can share ideas, you can submit early drafts of your proposal and then receive comments, and then you can revise your proposal accordingly. And then after that, you send the proposal to the publisher and start a formal process. Another do that I have on my list, when responding to your sort of the peer reviews, you know, whether they come, usually reviews come from book series editors. So that's Bloomsbury at least has that particular pattern. So when you respond to peer reviews, pick 3 points from the peer review, and that you think that you can collaborate on in a positive way, specifically what you find constructive in the comments and how you would like to shift your proposal of book to incorporate your suggestions. If you think, once you get reviews on your proposal, if you feel that it's not a fit, then don't waste your time. This is one of my don'ts. Don't waste your time. Look for a different publisher, different book series. Don't get emotional in your response to peer reviewers, and don't try to explain in your comments your original intent. As I said earlier, pick 3 suggestions and propose changes based on these 3 ideas. And then another suggestion, which is sort of do and don't at the same time. Once you receive your contract, don't disappear from the book series editor. Stay in touch. Continue to continue the dialogue. You can even send a chapter, and I'm sure the editor would be willing to read it and provide feedback, right? So that way, your voice, right? Sort of, you continue to stay on the book editor's radar, right? Your voice continues to be heard, and then you get hopefully a little bit of encouragement from the book series editor, right? Because you don't get that type of relationship when you work with a publisher. So these are some of the thoughts that I thought I would share with you right now. Thank you.
Do you have a question, that you would like to kind of share, with us? Or
it's kind of similar to what Susan said. I phrased it in a slightly different way. What are most effective ways to solicit proposals? Where do we go to find people who are writing, exciting books? Because a publisher doesn't help with that.
Well, thanks, Julia. I think, like you really picked up on something really important, that has to do with authors, and kind of, this bridging, into the world of the author and world of the relationships between the editors and the authors. And I think that Daphne has definitely very interesting and very enriching experiences that she would be able to share with us. So I would like to now invite Daphne and talk a little bit about her experiences.
All right.
Are you okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you, right?
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Hi. So I wanna. Okay. So I think my my career is kind of pasted together with accidents, mistakes, and some good luck. And and then the fear of being ashamed, and then a lot of labor, of course. So I'm not sure I have many don'ts to offer, because I feel some of the don'ts turn into do's. So so I have published 3 monographs and then 1 co-edited volumes, and these are from 2006, 2011, 2019, and 2020, just to give you an idea of the space between the books. So a couple of things that are a little bit unconventional about me, and one is, well, I'm an immigrant from Taiwan, so I basically operate in my professional career and all my writing in a language I picked up when I was in my 20s. So, and another thing is, my first book is not my dissertation. My dissertation is actually my 3rd book. So we can talk a little bit about that if we have time to think about that. So my first book actually started as a kind of a major mistake. I was basically tired of my dissertation, and I'm sure you can understand that after a few years of writing and researching. So when I had this opportunity to propose a postdoc at Stanford, I thought, well, since I'm gonna be in the Bay Area for 2 years, why don't I do research on the first Chinese immigrant theater in the US? That was kind of very romantic idea, because I know very little about that, and I proposed to do that. So, and then when I was at Stanford and I did more research, I realized that the 1906 earthquake and fire that destroyed Chinatown actually also destroyed all the archives and destroyed all the writing in Chinese. So a book idea is not gonna work. So my research there turned into 2 journal articles, and which become like later like the basis of 2 chapters. So, but I think that mistake itself was also a blessing, because that kind of forced me to reevaluate my original intent, my direction, the orientation of my research. So instead of writing a book on the earliest Chinese theater, which might be a little bit more like ethnic studies book or Asian American studies book, I took a transnational view and then look at Chinese opera as a sort of from this discursive and utopian way to look at the nature of the art. It's kind of discursive and utopian, and then to actually use intercultural and transnational theories to look at the art. So I think ultimately it's a much more interesting work, and then and I really do think it has bigger intervention in terms of for the field. And as for publishing this book, I agree, both of you, about talking to the editors, because that's how it happened. I remember seeing an email from ASTR, the listserv, saying a book series editor is interested in meeting some prospective authors. So I set up an appointment, and then I had my proposal and outline of chapters and a CV, and I met with him. And then a couple of months later, I got a letter from the publisher asking for sample chapters. So I sent in 2 sample chapters. And then a couple of months later, the review came back. It was in general very positive review. So I responded, and I didn't know what to expect. And then the book contract came. And I was actually really startled. I had no idea this would happen this way. So once I signed the contracts, so everything will just follow that way, because I as I talk about the fear, right? So if I sign the contract, I will have to do it. So if you're somebody who's like me, who can really work with this kind of external pressure, yeah, do your best to find a chance to talk to the editor, series editor, or if not, a publisher. And then once you have the contract, then you would just let the external pressure to take you there to finish. And I'm gonna talk about the third book, and I'll skip the second book. So my third book, as I said, is based on my dissertation. And so you will think it will be a lot easier because I'm a more experienced author, and then also, I've already spent so much time on this project. But no, I think this was the hardest one for me to write, and then for me to finish, and for me to negotiate with the publisher. I think the major problem here for me, very often I find myself in this kind of situation, is people don't know how to place me. So it's kind of the problem with taxonomy. So what are you? Which area are you in? So one of my major subjects is what we call Chinese opera. The term itself is erroneous. It's a Western concept to think about the art. But because the word is called Chinese opera, so people will think about, okay, Chinese, that means you're in East Asian studies. Opera, that means you're in music or musicology. So Chinese opera together, it could be ethnomusicology, which is totally not what I do. I feel very comfortable in theater and performance studies because when I talk about Chinese opera, I don't really analyzing the notes and that kind of thing. So that's why sometimes when I get reviews, in this case for this third book, is then so sometimes you feel people are from different disciplines. They want you to write a book from their discipline, but that's not the book I'm going to write. So it is difficult to negotiate that because obviously there are a lot of things I do not understand in their field, but you also have to respond to them. So I think ultimately it did help me to read more and to say, yes, I read this, but they actually don't fit. So that's kind of like I have to cover that ground and to say, yes, I know this, but that's not what I'm going to write. So I think even though it takes more time to do that, but I think ultimately it has helped. So let's see. So that's about it. So basically, my process has been talk to the editors, book series editor, or the publisher, and sometimes the publisher will come to talk to you. So get a general sense of whether your subject fits, and then have a title, have a proposal, have chapters ready. But in the first meeting, you will only show them the proposal and the outline, and then the chapters will follow. And that's kind of like my process. Some suggestions I would say when you write, keep index and glossary in mind when you write, because I think that will save you a lot of time, just the way to organize your thoughts. And then especially if you are working with more than one language, sometimes you will forget how you translate one term. So you want to make sure you are consistent with that. And then another thing about publishing is I was, make sure that the pictures you get, try to choose the vertical pictures instead of horizontal pictures, because you will get a much bigger picture on in the book if you have a vertical picture. That's usually my experience, because they won't turn the book around to use the whole horizontal picture. And yeah, so that's about my little journey. As for the questions, this is a question more like for authors than for thinking about publication, is how do you gauge the common sense of your readers? What I mean is, I just feel I always kind of like, I think I've explained it, I think people know, but then people don't know. And you have to explain yourself again, and whatever topic you're covering. So that for me sometimes it's a difficult part in terms of writing. I feel I'm tired of explaining myself or explaining what Chinese opera is, but yet people want you to explain. Okay.
Thank you, Daphne. That was really, really important. And this question of your target audience, your target readership, is really, really interesting. Thank you for bringing it up, because of course, we are working on one hand very often between disciplines, but also between cultures, between markets. I, for one, find it's very challenging, interesting, creatively challenging, to present the same material either to my North American colleagues or to my European colleagues or to my Russian colleagues. I find, that you always have to reframe, and you have to rethink about this, and it's a challenge. It's a challenge. But I think it's a creative one, so thanks for bringing this up, and I think we will continue with this. So Ramón, do you feel like it's a nice transition to what you would like to talk?
This is a great transition. Thank you, everyone. The great thing about being last on a sequence of so many brilliant people is that I get to pivot and walk around areas that you have not yet touched, because I'm in such agreement with what everybody has advanced. And I think they're really helpful strategies in thinking about how you might approach publication of a collection or a monograph. I am myself a co-editor at the Triangulation series at the University of Michigan Press, which focuses on queer drama, theater, and performance. And more broadly, I've co-edited a ton of projects, in part, and I think this is important to say, I work on very minor aesthetics by primarily Black, Indigenous, and people of color that do queer and feminist work in experimental genres. So part of the work is about staging conversations, informing my colleagues in the field about the kinds of material and the kinds of arguments that are outside US American or primarily European or even at times Canadian perspectives, and kind of broadening canons and pushing conversations forwards. So for me, the collection, the edited collection, has been a really helpful tool for intervening the field and for moving it in different directions, for expanding the voices that come into that space. And having said all that enthusiastic part of it, I've also found the edited collections to take far more time and commitment than the really focused monograph that we get to really cultivate across a really long period of time, but also where you're just talking to yourself for a significant amount of time rather than trying to make a significant number of voices coalesce. When I was a graduate student in the 1990s, at the height of the edited collection in theater and performance studies, right before most presses started announcing we've had enough, we need to slow down a little bit, there's too much production. I remember the proliferation of calls for papers everywhere. There was a new edited collection popping up every other week in our field. Performance studies was spreading as a keyword in the humanities. So a lot of the work that was emerging from theater, dance, performance studies was also circulating really widely. So there were lots of projects in process. And a lot of those projects never made it to actual publication. So you expended a ton of time sending abstracts, sending drafts, communicating with folks, and then you got that email a year later, sorry, everybody, we did not land a contract. We're moving on, right? And I say this as a way to say that experience of the frustrated, exceeding level of effort for a failed conclusion really textured the way I myself approach edited collections. I have never published a collection that has not emerged from a long dialogic process with my co-authors, whether that means we meet at one of our annual conferences in our professional organizations or build up ways of networking the thinking so that there's really a sense of an intellectual conversation happening as we're developing the project, so that all of the communication and all the shaping does not rest exclusively on the single point of view and standpoint of the editor alone, so that it really uses the idea of the collection to activate a community of thinkers to think about around a particular issue, an argument, right? And with that, I think, and Rick has participated in one of those for Performance in the Borderlands, which was the piece that we did for Palgrave. We did a few of them with Northwestern University Press here that were attached to some performance commissions and interviews and critical essays around artists of color that we wanted to advance. And most recently, I've done it with some of my colleagues for the Queer Nightlife book that's about to come from the University of Michigan Press in my own series. And I think it's really important. Some of those earlier failures, I feel, had to do a lot with precisely the lack of networking of a project. I think, one of the biggest dues that I have for everyone is to really start socializing your projects really early, to be, panels at conferences, roundtables, working groups, early conversations with editors, as many of you have already advanced. Those are really good ways of starting to really make sure that you have an argument at hand around what a collection is intending to advance, but also so you start finding the right cast for staging this conversation and doing it as broadly and effectively as possible. Following that, you always want to make sure that your edited collection has an argument. and I have to really stress this because oftentimes, and I get proposals for collections quite frequently whose primary logic is often a thematic collection of things, right? But really good collections that push the field, think beyond surface level collection of things that are similar or that address the same topic and make a robust argument for what does this conversation do to move the field or to shed new light on a particular topic and so on. And most, you're well trained to do that for monographs. And oftentimes it drops from collection proposals. It's one of the biggest problems when we're communicating with authors around how to shape a project so that it has legs. And I really think, so that's my second do. And my third do is to really edit in a way that animates an intellectual conversation, right? That really thinks about the component parts of the collection, that really gives your authors the opportunity to see and grow with each other's thinking. It'll make both your introductory argumentation around the collection, but also the work that results from the process that much richer. And it produces those kinds of collections that actually read like a book, right? Rather than just randomly selected individual pieces. My don'ts: don't pitch before you're ready, right? I think there's ways in which you can start socializing and talking about general ideas, but don't think that your conference is immediately going to have the destination of a book collection, right? Don't think that your panel is immediately a book. Take your time to think through the ideas, to vet them with potential editors and with colleagues and so on. And then you can move towards pitching a project. It's just a lot of times, and this has to do with, probably one of the reasons collections tend to at times suffer from too thin of an argument is that they've been pitched too early in the process of thinking both the topic and the component parts of the project. And the part of socializing your ideas, I think, is also about learning how to vet your participants, right? Learning who are the key folks that you want to bring into the conversation, but also who are the new exciting voices that are starting or advancing significant research into your topic that you may not know, and you want to take your time to get to know and network into the project, right? So all to say that these are, and I like the call for paper. There's nothing around the call for papers, but that I think it takes much more than that to really advance a successful collection, that you don't want to rely just on what drops in response to your call, but that you want to be an active editor in figuring out what is the best conversation to stage and with whom in order to push this question forward to the field. And I think I'll leave it at that because I think conversation will probably be more helpful at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ramon. Do you have a question, that you would like to put forward?
I do. So my question is along these lines of how to advance effective edited collections. And I'm interested in hearing from all of those, well, all of us on the panel have edited a collection before, and I'd be interested in hearing how did you go about making sure that your authors were aware of each other's arguments, and how did you sustain that volume-wide argument for your colleagues?
Thank you so much. I have Rick here, on the panel, and Rick was very actively participating last time. So I just feel, maybe Rick, you would like to jump in, and kind of, share some thoughts that you already might have, from the last conversation and this one, because I see there is lots of cross-pollination, there is lots of similarities, right? So how do you feel about that, to kind of jump in?
You promised me I wouldn't have to.
Okay.
No, I would just throw out a couple of questions, I think. And these are genuine questions. Whether, this is for a monograph, whether in fact it's better to get a contract or not. I have done a proposal and gotten a contract in the past. I have completed manuscripts without having done so. And I'm not sure which I prefer. So I'd love to hear what other people think about that. I think having a contract can sometimes force you into things that you don't necessarily want to do, whereas not having a contract can leave you writing things that the publisher you end up getting doesn't want, and having to make major revisions. So I'd love to hear people's experiences with that. Another thing I'd like to just throw out there as a question is what the difference is between an edited collection and a guest editing a special issue of a journal. And I think there are significant differences there in terms of what's expected of you, but also what it can do and can't do. And sometimes I think people propose special issues of journals that really want to do edited collections, and vice versa. So I think that'd be worth talking about. I also wanted to just throw out there, people have been talking about series editors. I think there's a difference to mark between a series editor who is a fellow scholar and an acquisitions editor for a press. And I think you have a different relationship with those. And if you're lucky, you'll have both. On a couple of occasions, I've done books for Tracy Davis's series at Cambridge. And Tracy's a fantastic series editor. And the advice I would give is to, if you have someone like that, work with her rather than with the acquisitions editor as much as you can. The acquisitions editor really won't help you much. They'll impose guidelines and rules and things, but the help comes from the series editor if you've got it. So those are just some thoughts. And the only other I'd say is perhaps fluffy, but don't pay for your illustrations until you know your book's coming out.
Well, thank you. I think it's a great addition, to what we already had. So I was trying to follow, the conversation and collect all the questions. And I think that we have a couple of them. Does anybody feel like jumping and picking up any question like from your memory, or should I refresh them a little bit? I probably should refresh a little bit. Yeah. Okay. So Rick proposed lots of questions that have to do with edited collections, but this question of contract, I think, came up earlier, and about, so this whole idea of whether, so you should be kind of looking for external motivation as a contract, or kind of follow your own lead, right? So like internal motivation, that was this question. The other one was the question about the most effective ways to solicit a proposal on one hand as an editor, but on the other hand, the most effective ways to find a partner, as an author, so to propose the book, right? And then there was the question about, really important question about moving the field forward, so how do we know that we are moving the field forward, either, through the edited collection or through the actual monograph? I think it's a general question that we actually face always, so and so on. Yeah, so, and then from before, we also had a question about moving the dissertation, from the dissertation kind of, format to the future book, so, and now I'm kind of opening this discussion, so does anybody would like to jump in? Maybe Susan, maybe Julia, Daphne, and so on.
Okay, I'll jump in.
Thank you.
The dissertation to a book, just a couple of comments on that, I guess. Your supervisor, and if your institution works this way, the external examiner should be your best friends on this. And a good supervisor should have already have some clear ideas as to whether your dissertation is a book or whether it's better in some other format. And if it is a book, what kinds of publishers you should be going off and researching as a possible venue for that. And I can say as a supervisor, you don't always get that completely right. I've certainly had a student who I absolutely thought had written a book and it didn't get published as a book, and she wrote something else instead that was very successful as a first book. And so, we're not 100% right, but I think we should be the people, and a good external examiner should do that work too. Contract, I agree with Rick. Sometimes contracts are a good thing because God knows I find it hard to finish anything anyway. And so if I have a contract, it does kind of push you over the finish line one way or another. And sometimes it's fun not to have a contract. I don't think for a first book, you're going to get a contract in advance of a full manuscript. It seems to me. I don't think that's a reality anymore, but correct me if I'm wrong, anyone. But it is a kind of obligation. You're stuck with a project, and sometimes maybe that project doesn't have the legs you thought it had, but you're stuck with a mandate to deliver something. So it's tricky, I think, and different points in one's career, there's different pressures to do certain kinds of things. And I think that factors into that as well. Sometimes deans like to see contracts when you're going into a sabbatical application or something like that, right? So it's complex.
To add to Susan's comment about contracts, I think, absolutely right. It's a lot harder to secure advanced contracts for a first book. And yet many institutions will require a contract by third-year review, by the renewal review of a tenure stream faculty member, right? So thinking about that timing and the institutional specificity of where you're working is really key. And there are some presses that are more willing to be developmental in their contracting, while there's other presses that want the manuscript fully done before they consider it for contracts, right? I was at an institution that required the book be contracted for renewal in the probationary period. And I was lucky enough that the University of Michigan Press does a lot of developmental editing and takes on projects and works with them, because I was a first-time ESL author trying to do a project for a US readership primarily back then. And I think that I benefited greatly from that type of platform. And it was a good match in terms of what my institutional requirements were, right? But I've had colleagues who have had to meet the same mandate and have gone to other presses like Duke University Press and NYU. And with either of those, you need about 3/4 of the manuscript ready, along with the proposal in order to advance into a conditional contract as well. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of, there's still possibilities, but they're slim. So you want to be really strategic depending on the position that you land, for sure.
Of course, know that all contracts are conditional, provisional.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to share my story. When I completed my dissertation and started looking for publishers, it was a long time ago. That was at the time when we were still receiving letters. So it was not an email correspondence. So I remember getting a letter from Cambridge, and it was phrased in a strange way, or maybe not a strange way, but it said something along the lines that they were really interested in my proposal and like the chapter that I sent along, but they probably understood that was a dissertation, because I attached my CV as well. And so in a letter it says that, please note, we do not publish unrevised dissertations. And frankly, I got scared because I was in my first year of a tenure track position, and I had a colleague who was working with Cambridge University Press, and it took him 10 years to finish his book. And so I decided that I should look around, and I ended up publishing with a different press. And till now, I remember that moment thinking, did I make a mistake? Should I have just taken my chances? And I don't know. There's no answer to this, right? But the pressure of having a monograph is real when you're on tenure track, and that was the decision that I made. Anyway, so.
Yeah, I think we, like our publication is so much tied into with our promotion and, like reviews and things like that. And I guess I'm very thankful that I just didn't know that much. So I was not scared not to work on my dissertation as my first book. And you just like, okay, I don't like this right now. I want to do something else. It might not have worked out, but it worked out for me. And I think a lot of time is just I am blessed by not knowing enough, because when I was a grad student, I hated to go to all these kind of panels that will give you advices about your career. I just skipped all those things. I just didn't want to hear about all this fear and all this anxiety. And I feel certainly I made a lot of mistakes. But then maybe sometimes it's good that I didn't know so much, so I don't scare myself that way. As for publishing my dissertation, more than a decade later, and I think it has good parts, because then I was certainly a much more mature person, and then to look at this project with distance, certainly, over the years, new theories have come out and new ways of analyzing this subject has come out. So I think it does benefit me quite a bit. And because my part of my book was really about, like, things that are 2,000 years old, right? So a lot of the primary material I researched on, I could still use that from my dissertation, but the whole theoretical frame is different. So, and then but I also know a lot of people, if they don't publish their dissertation, they will not go back to it. Or when they worked on their dissertation, it's not something that they're very passionate about, but then they just, okay, for the sake of graduating, they write something, right? So I don't really, recommend that you wait for a long time. But if it's something you really care about, I think it's fine to wait. And then I was also very careful not to publish my dissertation, not to publish much from my dissertation at all. So I would have a book, because I always knew that I will turn that into a book.
Thank you. I would like to a little bit stay on this topic, actually, the contracts and dissertations, so, and ask a difficult question about, so what happens, so how do you, what kind of strategies, people should have, when the book contract doesn't happen, or when the book contract does happen, but in the middle of the process, so something happens and your book does not reach, the final stage and so on, so a little bit to talk to the, maybe your opinion, your experiences, to the process of, to the negative side of this process, just to, again, to demystify that and to kind of show people that there are ways to deal with this kind of rejections, the problems and so on, because I think that, well, that happens quite often, right? So, or we don't like that, but it happens. So we do need some coping mechanisms. And again, it's an open question to everybody on the panel. And Rick, if you feel like jumping in as well, please do.
I think it was Rick that said, don't get emotional about these things. And that's easy to say and hard to do, but it's absolutely crucial, I think, to survival in this business. This is a business of rejection for the most part. And things that you send in for publication, grants you apply for, a lot of the time you're going to have a negative response. And I think the best you can do with that is to read the reports, read the reviews, see if there's something to be learned from it. Ask advice of one or two colleagues with whom you feel comfortable sharing these kinds of personal details for feedback, and then move on to the next thing. And I think sometimes that's going to a different publisher. Sometimes it's doing something else with that material. I'm not entirely sure you did it exactly this way, Daphne, but you sort of parked it to one side for a while and traveled back there when the time was right. I do think that most of what we think about for any length of time, we end up using in some form or another in our work, but sometimes it's just not the right moment for that particular project, and to trust in knowing that. Again, easy to say, not so easy to practice when you have pre-tenure pressures on you and so on. Again, for those of us who are in the Canadian system, it's a lot less cruel than the American system. And most Canadian schools will take a much more measured view for a series of well-placed essays versus the monograph. So if you've published in top tier journals, that's very much acceptable for tenure here. So somewhat differently. And I guess just one note to follow from Julia's comments before, which were right. I do think that publishers are quicker these days. That's one of the really positive things in the lifetime of my career. It's really unusual to see books taking 10 years to come out, where certainly when I started publishing, people said, don't go to 2 or 3 of the university presses. You'll never see your book in print. It takes forever. So that is a legitimate question to ask a publisher, as to what your normal turnaround time is, and to be able to have a sense of how that flows out. But I do think books get out quicker these days. The downside of that is I think there's way more responsibility on authors to make sure that fact checking and copy editing is done well, because publishing houses don't do that very well now. And so you may need to hire a professional if that's not something that you find very easy to do.
I wonder if I can, I don't know how many of people who are listening to us are aware of what doing a book proposal, trying to get a contract involves. That you go through a proposal, it includes a proposal, it usually includes an introduction, it usually includes a sample chapter. It includes a lot of work to do that. And I think one of the dangers of doing that is that when you're doing that proposal, you're trying to sell something. You're trying to make it marketable to a publisher. And it's a different kind of exercise than actually writing the book. And I think there's a real danger in getting pulled around by your own rhetoric, doing the best you can to sell the book, and then feeling you have to do that. So it's one of the things to really take into account, that they are different. Don't use the same language in the proposal as you do in the book. And the last 2 books I've done, I have not tried to get a contract. I've just submitted completed manuscripts for that reason. and I felt much more in control of what I was doing.
Well, that's actually quite very, very interesting. And I think it's really important for people a little bit more in advanced careers in a kind of a middle life, whatever career, you know. So when you are, like, you have pressures of teaching, you have pressures of administration, you have pressures of research, how do you manage this, you know? And this luxury, really a privilege, you know, to kind of spend your time with research, not rushing, you know, with the contract is something that I think we need to kind of reevaluate and relearn, I think, you know, so because I definitely feel that only now, I personally, at that stage when I actually can do that. Before that, it was all about really, you know, like moving forward with the steps, yeah, and so on. Yeah, so does anybody else, you know, have something to add to that? Ramón, Daphne? No?
I think I can just say that, as I said, if you are somebody who will work well with external pressure, and I think it's good to do that, because one of my experiences was just a special, like, edited journal, special edition, that kind of journal article. And the editor was quite relaxed about that. Just, well, whenever you're ready, then I will, you know, just like, that attitude kind of influenced me, and I feel that was like the worst experience that I had, because I don't know when I'm supposed to finish, and so I rather have a very clear deadline and try to meet it. If I cannot meet it, and that's something else, right? But if there's no deadline, that whenever you're ready, then I'm ready, then I don't work very well.
I would add that I one of the things I benefited from are really generous peer review processes for book proposals, right? It can really help you set the agenda for the writing in really significant ways if you expose yourself to review at that early stage, and much more so once you're past the probationary period of your career, right? And so I think it can be a really useful tool depending on the press. Again, a lot of these things are contingent to the particular culture of particular presses. Some presses are really thorough and invested in developmental process with early career authors or any project, and others just want a quick to production you know, contracted project, right? Because it's the urgency of keeping the lists healthy and pushing the field forward and so on, right? So you want to get to know the organization that you're venturing into and thinking with, but I think book proposal reviews can really shape up a project in very productive and significant ways. So I've benefited from that both for monograph and for collections as well, in terms of being able to have a good set, you know, and because I write in interdisciplinary fields, it helps me really shape and identify where what kinds of backgrounding I have to do for a project to land across multiple fields. And most presses that I've worked with have been really smart at sending those projects to representatives of different parts of those fields in order precisely to help shape that, right? Now, I also have stories where that has not worked positively, right? Because it has been sent at a proposal stage to probably the wrong reader, right? Who did not see or ride with the potential of the intervention. And on my insistence and, you know, hard-headedness to keep a project going forward, I've moved to another publisher. I've requested a different process and have been able to really make a, you know, especially complicated interdisciplinary projects with authors from many different methodologies and disciplines land, right? But I think those early proposal reviews were really helpful, even in convincing my authors that they needed to find a common language around their interdisciplinarity in order to land on a coherent book length collection argument, right?
I would like to add a few things. regarding reviews that you will receive, sometimes they can be harsh. My suggestion is to try to put them aside and then come back maybe a few days later and read them again and try to look, sort of see beyond the harshness of the language sometimes, and find the usefulness and what the readers actually suggest. So that's one suggestion. And another one, if you have a senior faculty, if you are tenure track, and if you're in a position of developing a book or book proposal, if you have a senior faculty, talk to them, share your work, get their feedback before sending your writing to the publisher or the editor. Don't hesitate. Don't think that if you share your work, then somehow you will present yourself in a position of, in a different position that you'd like to be perceived, right? Yeah, so that's just something that I learned myself when I began as junior faculty, and really got some really amazing suggestions and advice from senior faculty, not necessarily in my department. Actually, that's another thing. Sometimes, right, look in other departments, right, and see who else, right, who might be writing on a topic that you're interested in, perhaps from a different angle, and collaborate, talk to that person.
I think it's an interesting, segue, to the question that we touched upon a little bit before, actually, to this issue of working between disciplines, interdisciplinary, and we do know that performance studies is inherently an interdisciplinary kind of work that we do, and we know that we borrow things from different disciplines, and we are in conversation. So I would like to kind of go a little bit further on that and to think together and discuss, so how do you work, through these aspects of interdisciplinarity, when you are working with different publishers and with different projects, so because things do change, right? When you move from Russian field as a field to performance studies field, so and so on, or something like this. And together with that, so it's a question about the sort of the publishing in English. Does it mean that if I publish with Palgrave, it's kind of the same as I publish with Michigan Press, right? So if I publish with, try to publish with Australian, publishers, the same that is Canadian, it has a geographical difference in a way, a specificity that we should think about. Yeah, so again, open question to everybody. And then I go back to the audience, and I think there are some questions in the audience which I will pick up. Thank you.
Well, every publisher has an identity, and I think that's my point of doing that research, to see the kinds of books that they publish. And, I understand that's the topic of last week, but when I edited Theatre Journal, the thing that surprised me most was the articles that I received that had no resemblance to the kinds of things that were published in Theatre Journal. And you just sort of think, well, how did you not sort of see the connection or lack of connection? So if you do your research on publishers, you ought to be able to narrow your field to the ones that most suit your work. And I think some publishers that we would call theatre and performance studies publishers are more open to interdisciplinary approaches than others. The book that I think I'm working on at the moment, I have two very distinct audiences in mind for this book, and the publisher that I've been talking to suggested that I would actually have to have two completely separate sets of reviews from the different disciplines in order for it to appear on two different lists. So that is really a writing challenge as much as anything else, but it was useful to have that conversation early on to get a sense of how they might want to handle it. So again, to respond to the scenario that you mentioned, Yana, it seems to me that if your book is coming out and it has a main market and other markets that it might address, that's one of those moments where you have to be proactive in your marketing strategies. So, you know, to really alert book review editors in journals of those other fields that your book is out, to make sure that some kind of advertising goes to lists of scholarly association in those other fields and not just to, you know, ASTR, CATR or what have you. And unless you know, push, prod and whine, those things don't happen, right? So you really do have to go out there. The book series that I'm currently co-editing, we were agitating for a second email blast, and you would think, you know, you were asking for the sun, the moon and stars. So you do have to go and stay on the case of your publisher and make sure that you get review copies into the hands that you need to get them into.
To Susan's point, and one thing that I wanted to add, because as you're strategizing book production budgets and as you're requesting subvention funds from your institutions, I have changed my tune. Most presses will always ask you for subvention for production, but most people will not provide subventions for productions, right? It's a kind of pro forma request. They're hoping to land some from university presses, you know, to support what is a very expensive enterprise, which is book publishing. But what I've been doing with projects is ask my institution if they have a pool of resources available to split it between production and marketing. So I've been, you know, and the marketing budget, instead of advancing it directly to the press, we run it out of my own institution and try to push, you know, those things like press releases, those things like hosting an appropriate event and so on, as supplement to the viability of the project. And it is, Susan is absolutely right. You know, you can write an incredibly beautiful, field-changing monograph that goes nowhere if nobody knows that it's out there, right? So I think if you happen to be at institutions that do occasionally provide some monetary support for faculty publication, it may be to your advantage to split that between what you advance to the press as subvention of production and what you could also advance in your own maneuvering to make this project known once it's published.
Do we have anything more on this? No, Julia, Daphne, how do you feel? Rick? Not really. I have a question from the chat. So, and this is actually time for our audience, you know, to become more active and ask more questions. You know, if you feel at this point that you would like to turn on your camera and speak, you know, so please do. There is a question in the chat, and there is a problem. Yuri has a problem with the mic, so I will ask for him. So this is the question, open to everybody. In what stage of your career as a writer, as a scholar, did you respond to a serious editor regarding how your work was positioned from a national conversation, Canadian American, to a broader field of international conversations? So do you have any advice regarding how you select your case study, regional versus global, and whether the series editor often influences this decision? And how do we decide on who our audience is as a first book? Is it more advisable to think of audiences as those we know already or want to reach as someone new, I guess? Yeah, so yeah. So the question was, you know, from kind of, you know, national audience to international, from regional cases to global, you know, so how do you make those choices, you know, in your monographs, you know, and then who's your audience in this case? Yeah.
Well, I can start. Well, I think again, it really depends on what publisher you're working with and what book series you're looking at. The one that I'm editing right now with Alyssa Clark at De Montfort, UK, is very intercultural and transdisciplinary. So we are intentionally soliciting proposals that actually address intercultural and transdisciplinary dialogues. And if we receive a proposal that wouldn't, then we meet with the author and talk about whether there's a way for that particular book to perhaps expand a little bit, and if there's no way, then perhaps we're not the right fit, right, as was discussed before. So I think it really depends on what publisher you're working with, what specific book series you're working with, and what your own interest is, right? I also think that it's important that you don't just do something because that particular book series is looking at transdisciplinary, transcultural proposals, if that's not something that you're interested in.
Okay, I will say something. This is based on my own experience. What do we mean by international, transnational, intercultural? Basically, we're still talking about the West versus the rest. So the experience I had was when I think about, when we always see universities talking about we want to go international, we want to go, global. So when I was very naive, I thought it would mean if I publish in Chinese, if I publish in a Chinese journal, that's good, right? But no, it's not. It's actually not a welcome gesture, even though it's a very established journal, because people don't know how to read it, people don't trust the thing you write, and because you are writing for a different audience, the tone, the way you talk about things is very different. So that's what kind of my question about, like, the common ground, right? How do we know what the common sense is? How do we know the common ground is? Because I have to explain things for that audience. But if I translate that article back into English for my review, which is what I had to do, then it became like, why do you need to explain these things in your article, right? So then pretty early, I learned, okay, it's not a good idea to publish in a different language at all, because university doesn't want that. So I think that is also something that we need to think about, even though we're doing a transnational, intercultural, that kind of approach. It's still based in the West with the theories, with the language, even though we try to solicit people from all over the world to write in this intercultural collection, for instance. It's still based on that. And you can see that very clearly in international conferences as well. Right. So this is just kind of like my experience to think about what is intercultural, what is transnational. Because we are writing in English, because we're talking about the Western academia, the base is still in the West.
I actually would like to agree, add my own comment on this, because what I find that not only that the audience is different, but also methodologies. Like, I really find, that what I am focusing on, when I'm talking to the North American audience, so I'm more focusing on theory, on ideas, on some kind of, intellectual, moving the field, on terms of this, kind of way. But when I have to talk to my Russian audiences, it's more sort of, rooted in facts in historical research, in some kind of maybe more close text analysis and so on. So it calls for different methodologies, and it also kind of reflects different knowledge that your audience expects from you, right? So when you're talking to somewhere in Europe or in Russia, so if you don't know a number of small facts, little, histories, local histories, that make your argument convincing, so it's very difficult to actually go with your audience, right? So your audience will be suspicious, whereas when you're speaking to the North American audience, you might not need that many little facts and so on. So I find it that's why I'm saying, it's challenging and it's interesting, but challenging. Does anybody else would like to?
Well, I'd like to add just a comment to this, Yana, because that, what you just described as different methodologies, cultural methodologies, that makes work on an edited collection very difficult. Because if you do reach out, right, if you do go outside the Western canon and invite and work with scholars and artists from sort of a non-Western, right, the sort of other cultures, then the question becomes, okay, how do you make sure that that there's certain uniform perspective, right? Because they do write, even if they write in English, they write in a different way, right? Their approach to scholarship is perhaps rooted in kind of a different understanding of a subject matter. So that it's tricky, it's exciting, it's challenging, but it's certainly tricky.
I think what I would add to that is that there's a lot, especially in the context of the edited collection, there's a lot of work for the editor who takes on a project with aspirations to have an international reach, right? And the responsibility is really to be able to bridge those different conversations, right? To find a meeting point where that thought can advance, understanding that the contexts are different, that there's different urgencies to scholarship in different places. I work in some contexts where we're still building archives because they're precarious, being lost, not readily available, and so on. But that does not mean that there's not sophisticated theoretical knowledge being advanced in that process and in those materials and in engaging those materials, right? So there's part of the editorial work and really internationally minded work that has to do the act of translation. You mediate the translation across different actors in the field, and at the same time sustain an argument that can move forward across the collective work, right? And it's not easy. I mean, almost every single collection that I've produced has included work that I've translated from folks coming from Latin America, coming from French-speaking contexts, and so on, as a way of really forcing that issue of trying to have conversations beyond the centrality of North American academia or Anglophone academia, right? And to reach other contexts, but doing so requires a different kind of work. You just have to figure out how to thread those things through, but they're important and valuable ways of advancing the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think the cultural translation is much more difficult than linguistic translation. I actually have a question for those of you who have been book editors, edited multiple volumes, because what you expect or what you planned originally will probably turn out to be very different, because people do not finish, people drop out, and maybe certain articles they write, you decided not to use them. So what's the best way to deal with that?
That's a tough one, Daphne, right? Because sometimes, I mean, some of it is out of your own editorial choice. Sometimes it comes out of your readers' reports, right? So there's all kinds of different moments where you have to rethink the composition of your project and either go back to authors and readjust and bring the work up to speed or up to sometimes it's not about quality, it's about fit, right? Does it advance the conversation? Does it contribute to the question? And it's one of the most useful things about sending manuscripts for review, because especially edited collections, because one of the main points of focus for peer review on collections is whether the project coheres and whether each of the contributions aligns precisely with a focus project, right? But of course, it's heartbreaking when you have to tell somebody that the piece is not going to make it. But you want to start, as you socialize your ideas early, telling people and working on the conditional that this is a provisional project, making sure that the experience of dialoguing around the ideas is pleasurable enough that if the project fails, or if an individual or a piece fails, the person has still had the benefit of being in conversation, advancing the project. And I've been known to pick up a project that fails, an article a chapter that fails in a collection, and work with the author to place it somewhere else, like in a journal issue or something like that, right? So because they've had the conversation with me along the process, and maybe the piece is not ready at the time where it needs to be, or it did not develop in a way that it fits with the rest of the conversation, but it's still valuable, serious research that can see the light of day at a different platform, right? So being generous about editorial practice is another thing. Also knowing that most people that are editing projects are just as busy as the rest of us anyway. So it's really difficult. You have to balance generosity with energy and the little bit of time you have remaining. But that I think, there's good ways of doing it that do not dead end with just the piece was not included, and that's it.
Well, thank you, everybody. Once again, we have 2 questions in the chat. So, and I will ask Meerzon, maybe to start the conversation, So, yeah, and then, yeah, Joseph.
Sure. Thank you, Yana. Thank you all for your very helpful thoughts and advice. So my home institute will release doctoral dissertations to the public 2 years after our doctoral defense. And I don't know to what extent this should actually play an effective role in our plan for preparing our dissertation for publication. Does it matter at all? Should we feel pressure that we have to publish it before the due date, before it gets accessible to the public or not? That was my question.
Meerzon, that's a really good question. And I just want to cite Susan again, because Susan says some valuable things. But rarely the book that you produce out of dissertation will look exactly like the dissertation. But that is a really big anxiety and question by most students finishing doctoral projects here in the United States. There's now a movement towards sequestering dissertations, which I'm not convinced by, precisely because I feel like, the knowledge and the research should be available publicly as soon as possible, especially if you're working at a public institution, which means your research is state funded. And I like the idea of sharing the ideas and findings, also knowing that a book is going to take a significant amount of years to develop a different kind of argument on that same data and that preliminary partial exercise that is the PhD dissertation, right? So what I would say is I would not worry about having to publish a book in 2 years before the dissertation is made public. As a graduate student, I was actually really surprised that my dissertation was being cited by other scholars in my field as a dissertation while I was, just, starting my career and starting to publish other materials. And I think that's fine. What you want to make sure is that you develop from the dissertation the kind of book that will move forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, my advice also is to see if maybe you can start a dialogue with your university to consider several dissemination options, because we had the same issue, and students in English actually who have MFA in creative writing, they were very unhappy that their MFA projects, novels or poetry were published. And so at my institution, we actually have 3 different dissemination options. So 2 years, I believe it can be disseminated right after you defend. Then the next option is 2 years. And then the third option is 5 years. And that was a student-led project. They started writing letters to a school of graduate studies to express their concerns. So I wonder if maybe that's something you can look into.
Sure, thank you. I will.
Just one more thing. I said this last week, but keep in mind that, as both Ramón and Susan have said, the dissertation transformed into a book will be a major transformation. It'll be different. But also, the only people who will find your dissertation are people who are looking directly for it. Whereas once it turns into a book, other people will see it. It'll be more broadly read. It'll be read for different reasons. So you won't be tied to the keywords that people are searching for your dissertation under.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you. We have another question, Joseph, do you feel comfortable asking your question yourself, or should I do that?
Thanks, Yana. I can ask it.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone and to the organizers as well. I've enjoyed both the last panel and this panel. It's very helpful. I just wanted to ask, both Susan and Ramón have pointed out that there's a lack of marketing support from publishers, which can limit the critical influence of books that come out. And I'm just curious, I was kind of surprised by that. Why don't publishers invest more time and resources into marketing? I would think that they'd stand to benefit from such publicity. So I'm just curious what the source of that is.
Budgets. University press budgets have been significantly cut back over the past decades. So everybody's trying to keep producing with less money, and really trying to be creative about other strategies for dissemination at a time when publicity budgets for fields that are relatively small, especially, are not seen by major press operations as worthwhile investments. So we benefit from living in an interdisciplinary field that is intimate enough that we have a clear sense of who comes to our conferences and so on. But for presses, because we're not the gigantic English or history disciplines, investing in publicity outside of the usual press catalog is seen as really, a bit of a loss of money compared to market and size of list. So that's why I think we've seen some erosion. There's still some presses that do incredible publicity work. I think Duke University Press does really good work for their publications, and sometimes so does NYU Press, right? So it depends. There's still some out there that have a real publicity gain, but it's not the totality of the presses, in part because of the erosion of budget security for those types of projects.
Yeah, a commissioning editor of a major American university press told me that they expect to lose $25,000 on every scholarly monograph they publish. So, no surprises that there's no money for marketing. So the way that balances out, it seems to me, is that some books are, on automatic buy from libraries, particular series, so that sort of makes money. And they advertise in particular ways to stay in front of acquisitions people in major university libraries, and books that are attached to possible teaching opportunities, particularly at an undergraduate level. And I'm not sure that anybody's ever had this conversation with me explicitly, but I've certainly had this conversation implicitly, that a press will do a certain kind of monograph, but you kind of owe them one of those handbooks or something afterwards, that they might, recoup some of the money they're about to lose on your monograph. But yeah, there's not very much money for marketing, and so I absolutely second Ramon's suggestion of trying to get your institution to find a small pocket of money to help you with that work. I do know colleagues who have hired PR people to do that work for them. That's an investment of your own hard-earned cash, but it often leads to things like NPR interviews and write-ups in non-academic publications, but cultural leaning publications. One of the things I think is quite interesting right now is there's increasingly, don't know quite how to describe them, sort of intelligent online publications that are not academic, but they're not fluffy either. And some of those publications are quite interested in getting accessible pieces from academics about their work. So the volume that I co-edited with Sonia Masai on Ivo van Hove, we got quite a bit of pickup from these sort of smart theatre orientated online publications saying, could you write us, 500 words about this particular production or his place in auteur directors or what have you. And that was a good way of marketing the book a little bit, a book that we had genuinely hoped would have a non-academic audience. So, you look for whatever venues you can find, but you need to take responsibility for that.
Another thing I think we can do is we can help each other. We can help promote for each other, teach the book. And one thing I find is usually in my university, when you talk to a librarian, they will buy the book. So it could be a book that they already have, but they don't have the ebook version. And then you can convince them to buy that. Because books are so expensive nowadays and students don't buy books. So if the book is not available in the library, no one will read it. Right? So, but I find it's actually easier to I mean, it's not that hard to convince the librarian that we need certain books. So we can all help each other as well.
On the marketing side, I would add also, and to Daphne's comment, is that, and this doesn't happen, is not as effective for all kinds of projects, but, my work tends to be ethnographic and tends to focus on fairly recent history, which means a lot of the artists and the communities that I'm working on are around, right? And, there's nothing better than seeing your book at a community center that sees themselves written about, at an artist reception after the closing of their next performance because they've been written about. So that kind of, informal marketing networking of the impact and circulation that your project can have, which is really on you and the relationships that you keep as a scholar as you develop them. And it could also be just a particular kind of archivist that is particularly enthusiastic about the work, the historical work that you're advancing and so on. A lot of these folks are potential multipliers of the announcement of the presence of your work, right? And I think it's really important to just not think ads alone, but really to think about, we're in the era of social media, we're in the era of network participatory communication, and that is really one of the best ways to advance the ideas of your project. And to echo Susan's point about really hitting broader readership platforms and translation that really introduce and apply the work of your scholarship for wider audiences, that will get you readership as well, especially interdisciplinary readership. It'll pique people's interest and you'll be searched for.
Great, yeah, thanks for this responses. I think I have Jackie Tokaino too with a question. Please go ahead, Jackie.
Yes, thank you so much, Yana, and thank you all for sharing your time so generously over the last two sessions and going into the third. My question is, and a lot of the discussion has been about a lot of things that you could do if you're tenure track or you have an institutional support. Subventions don't exist for scholars who are in precarity. So what are your suggestions for those of us who continue and face a long road of sessional or contract labor? How do we, because I don't think not publishing the book is an option anymore. I think we still need to publish the book, and it looks like more and more that's going to be necessary on a CV even to get a foot in the door these days. So what are your suggestions?
it's a tough one, I think, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, it is the case that not all publishers require a subvention. In fact, I mean, I think Ramon's right. Most publishers will ask for one, but they don't necessarily need to get one. So don't give up is the first piece of advice. Push and push back.
Yeah, I think that may be, you know, if a press makes it conditional to subvention, you move to another press. You know, because that's just getting too close to pay for play, and you don't want to be in that position. And I think most presses, if they believe in a project and would take it on, will say it would help us if you can get resources, but we're committed to the project and they'll move forward. And, you know, we're at a moment, you know, where we have so many different, you know, I think we're at a moment where the field is overproducing again, right? There's so many different series and there's so many publication platforms right now. I have a hard time keeping up with our own field right now, because it's been overproductive, in part because everything is being turned into a book. And I don't think everything should be a book. And I think the question that Rick brought around journal issues and so on is a really important one, because I think at some point we need to reassess, you know, and really think, what are the objectives of, you know, not all scholarly forms need to be in book form, right? And I think we need to think about other places where we want to have the conversations and teach the field and teach the evaluators for promotions and appointments and so on, to move beyond the traditional monograph platform alone and to look at a more complex ecology of sharing scholarship.
Well, I think for subvention, you know, professional organizations, you know, it will have subvention, that kind of award. Of course, it, you know, it's only one person gets it, maybe at most two gets it, but try, you know, and then I do think, you know, we are trying to help people. So for instance, I will not even apply to those awards when I was working on my book, because I know there are people who need it more, right? So there is some help in the field, but of course, without the institution, it's difficult.
Rick, can you say something about the aid to scholarly publishing in Canada? Because I think that's relevant for folks that are sitting in on this session. And I have to confess, I've never been through it, which I think maybe you have.
I have 150 years ago. So I wouldn't claim to be up to date on it. Interestingly enough, my dissertation was accepted by a major university press, who then went for the aid to scholarly publication, and they rejected it. So that book, thank God, was never published, and turned into articles. Then my actual first book did get a subvention from aid to scholarly publications. I can't remember how much, but it was quite generous. And if that program is still in place, I strongly recommend people working particularly on Canadian subjects go there. The question Yana raised earlier about national differences, people following this conversation probably should know that it's almost impossible to get anything published by a US-based press or a UK-based press that articulates its subject matter as Canada. So the Aid to Scholarly Publications program will help you get it published by a Canadian university press when you probably can't get it published elsewhere. And if you are trying to get it published in a US or UK-based publisher, try to pretend it's not about Canada. Make it about a bigger subject. I published a book called Performing the Intercultural City. Well, it was always called Performing Intercultural Toronto until I sent it to American press, because nobody's interested in Toronto. They might be interested in the intercultural city. So there are ways of, and then the introduction framed that book as a case study about something larger, not as being about Canada. So there's two ways of answering two different questions. But yes, I would look into the scholarly publications program in Canada if you're a Canadian scholar, and assuming it still exists.
Well, your response, Rick, actually takes us back to the earlier question that Yuri had about, national versus international examples as well. I have Nicole Nollet in the audience. Nicole works mostly in French, and Nicole is the president of SCAT. And Nicole wants to volunteer some information. So Nicole, please go ahead.
Hi, Yana. Thanks for letting me talk a bit, and thanks to the other panelists for letting me talk. I do have experience with the AIDS to Scholarly publication program. I did apply for this program for my book on theater. It was published in French with the University of Ottawa Press, and it was always pitched as a Canadian studies book and as a theater book and as a translation book. And so we thought it would be really relevant to pitch it for this this program, which gives about $8,000 to the university press for the publication. And I did also have the press demand that this money come through for my book to be published. And I was a postdoc at the time, and it was really pretty precarious actually to have this my contract be contingent on this this program. But it is accessible, and the press does help to push forward a dossier that will be evaluated by the scholarly press program once the evaluations are in and once the author has responded to the evaluations.
Thank you, Nicole. We have about 5 minutes left before the 6 o'clock hour, and we kind of should wrap up. So do we have anything, this is a question to the panelists, and do we have something like last minute thoughts, that you would like to share, with the audience? Something like, yeah.
Well, I like what Ramón said about shared scholarship. I think that's really a neat concept, and something that's, I think, becoming more and more relevant. I'm not sure how it affects younger scholars, because unfortunately for them, there's still a requirement, perhaps at most institutions, to write a single author book. But I know that I sit on university promotion committees, and there are more and more projects that I see that are they're not edited collections, but they're co-authored books, and not necessarily in theater performance studies, but in history and philosophy. So I just see this as an exciting, I guess, pattern, because it invites more conversations and fruitful dialogues.
I also, if I can, I teach a seminar. I teach a PhD seminar on my book subject before it comes out. So I think that's also a way to kind of engage the dialogue, to see what our students think about, this project.
I wanted to pick up on a similar, that picks up on Ramon's question from earlier about how to socialize around a project. I just wanted to say that the best experience I've ever had was the books that Ramon and Harvey Young did on Borderlands, which was a brilliant process. They brought everybody who was writing chapters in the book down to Northwestern. We spent a weekend socializing, giving our short versions of our paper, talking to one another about our papers. And in fact, that book published a conversation at the end of that weekend among all of us as the final section of the book. That was absolutely brilliant. We went through, I suppose it was a year's process, but any way that you can manage to, I know that must have cost a fortune from Northwestern to do that, but any way you can get that kind of process into place where we're actually genuinely talking across the different chapters in a book while they're in development is fantastic. So thank you, Ramon.
And I'll add to that that, you know, our professional organizations sometimes have funds to incentivize this. The Queer Nightlife volume that I'm about to take out started with you know, instead of a concluding symposium, started with a preliminary conversation with the authors. And then it moved out to the ASTR Jose Munoz platform, which is a 3-year platform to hold a working group. So we've really taken our time to massage this project and to really develop the conversation for this volume. So the first 2 sessions at ASTR were about developing the work and offering editorial commentary and so on. And then the next one, if we all manifest live, will be about presenting the book. But it took those 4 years to really slowly socialize so that the book reads like a conversation. And I think those kinds of strategies are immensely useful to making an edited volume cohere.
Thank you so much once again, you know, so to everybody on the panel, to Ramon, to Daphne, to Susan, to Julia, to Rick for joining us. That was really, really a fantastic conversation, really enriching, you know, so I would like to invite people who stay in the call. If you have questions, you know, write them to me directly, you know, I will forward them to the panelists. And we will try to reconvene on April 19th, you know, for another session. So, and again, thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, for your experience. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for hosting, and thank you, everybody. I learn every time we come into these things, so I really appreciate everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.